Hello, everyone. I'm Diana Marrero, Director at The Hill. Welcome to this morning's briefing, America's Opioid Epidemic, Youth Awareness and Prevention. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors, education technology company EverFi and its Prescription Drug Safety Network. As the opioid epidemic roils communities across America, our nation's schools and colleges are also feeling the impact. Educators and counselors are not only helping children who live with addicts in their homes, but are also themselves addicted to opioids. What steps should be taken by family members, physicians, schools, public health officials, and leaders in Congress to prevent the misuse of opioids? How can we overcome funding challenges and raise awareness about the impact of opioid addiction at the K-12 and college levels? We're looking for answers to all of these questions and more this morning. Before we begin, a few housekeeping notes. In addition to our audience here at the museum, we're also live streaming on thehill.com/events. Please keep your phones on silent. However, we do want to encourage you to engage in the discussion on social media. You can follow us on Twitter at The Hill Events and using the hashtag YouthOpioidAwareness. We're going to be taking questions from our audience, so please be on the lookout for members of our team with handheld mics. Finally, there's a short feedback survey on each of your chairs. We'd love to hear your feedback. I'd encourage you to turn in the survey at the end of today's program. So let's dive right in. We begin this morning with Senator Shelley Capito. Her state of West Virginia is bearing the brunt of the opioid epidemic and has the highest rate of overdose deaths in the nation. Senator Capito is a member of the Appropriations Committee and has introduced a number of bills in Congress in an effort to help combat the opioid crisis through prevention, education, and treatment. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Senator Shelley Capito. Joining her on stage is my colleague, Bob Cusack, the Hill's editor-in-chief. Bob, over to you.
Thanks, Diana. Senator, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Bob.
As Diana mentioned, your state has the highest death rate in the United States because of opioids. What does Washington, D.C., the Beltway, not get that you are hearing on the ground in West Virginia about this epidemic?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and this is an extremely important topic for our state, our region, and really the country. What I hear is there's multiple families are touched. This addiction issue goes across any kind of socioeconomics, any kind of, well, mostly focused in the younger ages, 25 to 35, but it has just immense reverberations throughout our state, from 1,000 more children in foster care right now in our state. Keep in mind, our state's a small state. We have 26,000 grandparents raising children. We have our fire and our first responders going out multiple times a day to take people and get them out of their overdose. So it's just an enormous issue, and every day I could basically find somebody in our state. I would be hard-pressed to find somebody in our state who doesn't know somebody who's been affected by this directly.
Your state has an education initiative focusing on 6th to 12th graders. How important is the education? Have you seen progress in teaching kids about this issue?
Well, I think what we've learned is we can't arrest our way out of this problem. We have very vigorous law enforcement. We just had an enormous bust in Huntington, West Virginia, that broke up one of the big drug rings that comes out of Detroit, and that was a great effort there. But what we're seeing is we want to work on the prevention and wellness side. And so our state legislature passed an initiative to incorporate this into the curriculum. Interestingly, I saw a superintendent of schools just yesterday, asked him, how is that going? How's that initiative going? He goes, well, we were teaching it in homeroom. Well, I don't know if you guys remember homeroom, but you're not really paying much attention in homeroom. And you're just, happy to be there and get counted present. And so they decided that they really need to incorporate the curriculum and build it into their science curriculum so that it becomes a part of a larger topic, so it's more part of the school year, all throughout the school year, and not just in the 2 or 3 minutes that you catch the kids in the morning at homeroom. So I think that the state has recognized that this is extremely important, and there's lots of different ways to go about it. So I'm really pleased that it's been put into the curriculum in our schools.
What can Washington newsmakers do next? There's a lot of pending legislation, CARE 2.0 bill,
right.
Which you're a co-sponsor of, and that would give $10 million for opioid education. What can be done? Because the consensus in Washington is that Congress is done for the year. It's an election year. We can't get anything done until after the election.
Well, I think CARE 2.0, I think, has great possibilities here. This is an issue that crosses party lines. I know on the panel later on today, you're going to have Senator Sherrod Brown. Senator Brown and I have worked on an initiative for transitioning out of recovery. If you transition out of recovery, you need to find a job. Well, that's an issue because a lot of these folks have felonies or they have low self-esteem, they don't have job skills and things of that nature. So that transitional point. So it's we have all kinds of things in this initiative that I've worked on. Some aimed at youth. We don't really look at our teenagers who are suffering from addiction and what kind of treatment is different than an adult treatment and a recovery plan. So I've joined with Senator Peters, I believe, on that initiative. Senator Hassan and I have joined together, and I believe we're going to pass this out of the Commerce Committee today to try to close the urban and rural divide in terms of treatment. And most people assume that drugs are festering in the urban area when in fact New Hampshire and West Virginia are some of the most highly affected states, the more rural states. So we want to make sure that we have parity and that we're looking at this problem in equal portions. I mean, I could go on with some of the spectrum of solutions, but there's lots that we can do. Data, more data for with our pharmaceutical and our pharmacies to make sure that they are sharing data, the PDMPs, so they're reporting data. I live in a border state. Basically, you can go to Huntington, you can go to Portsmouth, Ohio, or Ashland, Kentucky. You know, our states need to be sharing data in case somebody's doctor shopping or somebody's pharmacy shopping to make sure that we can prevent the filling of prescriptions that are of opioids that are then used for nefarious purposes or addictive purposes. So there's all kinds of things that we're doing now. But I think the communities that have joined together have decided that they're not going to wait on Washington. There are a lot of community initiatives that are moving through all of our communities that are having a lot of success.
You mentioned rural America. I remember going to Manchester, New Hampshire in 2015 of the fall. Really, no one in D.C. was writing about the opioid crisis, and it was another lesson you got to get outside the Beltway. What are the specific challenges for rural America with opioids?
Well, certainly the lack of providers is a huge issue. The lack of treatment, it came up so fast. You said 2015 people weren't writing about it in New Hampshire. You know, we were ill-prepared to have recovery centers or recovery coaches, or, you know, our emergency rooms are getting deluged with people having overdoses. They come out of their overdose and bam, they're right out back out into the population, into the behavior that got them there in the first place. So we've worked on programs such as working with emergency rooms so that in a rural area where somebody comes in with an overdose, at least you're going to have some kind of home health follow-up visit, whether it results in anything or not, at least have some follow-up with this person to say, you know, the next day or the next 48 hours to see what kind of situation this person is in after recovering from an overdose. But I would say our biggest issue is our manpower, our mental health professionals, our recovery and treatment centers. Our transportation is always an issue. And our overloaded first responder network is really taking it on the chin.
How do you assess the Trump administration on how they've dealt with this epidemic? What have they done well, and what could they do better?
Well, I think the president declared this a public health emergency. I think there was some rumblings that he didn't declare it a public emergency, which I guess would rise the level of funding and others. But I think he's on the right track here. It is a health emergency. It is a public health emergency, and I think they've reinitiated that call. The president has talked about it. We've got $6 billion in the omnibus bills that we passed in March to try to meet the challenges of communities and states to be able to treat and also to follow up and to wellness and prevent and to law enforcement. I mean, it's not enough money, but it's a big slug of money there, and so I'm pleased about that. I will say the First Lady has taken this on as an initiative. She came to West Virginia, and she went to Huntington, West Virginia, and she visited a place called Lily's Place, which is an innovative way to treat babies who are exposed to drugs. They're called NAS babies, neonatal abstinence syndrome. It's a strange name, I think, to understand what it is, but it is some of the saddest things you've heard, which these are pregnant women who use all the way through their pregnancy, and then their babies are born with drug exposures. And so Lily's Place is a place where you're out of the hospital. It's a off-hospital site. It's got several rooms, like 12 to 15 rooms, and it's to try to rock the babies and to treat the babies out of the medical atmosphere in a more home-like situation. And it's really, I would recommend to all of you if you're interested in it, it's called Lily's Place. But the First Lady took a great interest in this, and she mentioned this in her Be Best initiative that she initiated, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks ago. So I think the administration is fully on board here. But I'm going to admit to always being a bit disappointed that it's not enough all the time. The focus needs to stay here because we're losing a generation. And I tell my friends who's from states that are not as affected as West Virginia or New Hampshire or Ohio, if we don't knock this out in our states, it's coming to your state. It's coming to your youth. It's coming to your families. And we want it because the drug dealers are not going to give up on this. And so we need to make sure that we are aggressive where we know the biggest choke points are. And that's why I've worked also with Senator Shaheen and Senator Hassan to focus more money to the more high mortality states like ours.
In a recent speech, the president called for the death penalty for some drug dealers. Do you think that's a good idea?
You know, if I thought that would solve the problem, I'd be right on board with that. I mean, I think that I don't necessarily agree that it's going to solve the problem. I mean, I think you need a spectrum of solutions. I'd have to look at it more closely. I mean, I think it sounds good, and I'm not being critical of him. I think he's trying, but I don't think that's going to solve the problem.
I don't know if you've heard, but there's a big election for the Senate in your state
really?
This year, and it's gotten a lot of attention, a lot of press, and we have a story on Don Blankenship possibly running as a third party. It's going to be one of the most closely watched, I think, Senate races because President Trump won the state by 42 points. Does that election help put a spotlight on this issue? Because both candidates obviously talking about it. All three, actually, now.
If you look at the polling on where the issues are for years and years and years, and I still maintain this is the number one issue. Jobs and the economy is always the issue in our state. We have challenges. But this crisis has moved beyond that. This is on everybody's mind. So I would imagine that both candidates, all three candidates, will be talking about this frequently, criticizing one another for not being aggressive enough or being involved in other ways. So yes, it will shine a light on this. Absolutely.
You mentioned working with members of both parties, and it's such a polarizing time in Washington. And you mentioned Senator Brown, who we'll be talking to later this morning. Can you describe the coalition of bipartisanship on opioids? Obviously, it affects so many states, and
right.
and the experts say it's getting worse. But can you just describe how that works? Do you meet regularly? Do you just talk off the Senate floor of trying to move legislation like CARE 2.0 and moving stuff in a very partisan environment?
Well, I think it really attracts the states that are most highly affected. If you look at the most aggressive senators in this space, I would put me in that space of being from West Virginia. The New Hampshire senators, the Ohio Senator Portman has been very upfront with this. And as a matter of fact, we're working on a bill called the Stop Bill, which would help with the fentanyl coming in through the Postal Service, which the fentanyl now has become the most lethal drug in overdose deaths. And I think that's mostly what's driving it. When I think about all the people that I've co-sponsored bills with which is numerous. Then you get to be sort of known as, you know, an opioid an addiction advocate to try to solve this problem, and we sort of band together. We don't really meet as a group, but we all know our staff members are very, very well known to each other and work on this. And we're always trying to look for different solutions. You came up with a solution with Senator, I believe it's Senator Warren. Well, that was on the prescribing side to try to lower the prescription days of prescribing some of these highly addictive opioids, but also have worked on another kind of niche issue, like if you're in hospice care. And a lot of times hospice patients will have pain medicines. I mean, my parents were both in hospice before they died. And the hospice nurse is prevented now by law from being able to destroy the extra drugs that you have.
She can't.
No.
Can't destroy.
So you leave it to the family. Where do we know a lot of this starts? It starts with grandmothers and grandfathers' medicine cabinets.
Right.
And it's just, you know, you think to yourself, does that make sense? No. So we've tried to close that gap. So there's little loopholes and big ones that we're trying to gather together. But there's no shortage of people who are passionate on this.
We're going to open it up for questions. We have people with microphones, so if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll come to you, but don't start until we get the mic because we're live streaming. And if you can identify yourself, and if you can, keep it brief so we can get as many as we can.
Hi, Will Estes. I'm with the American Medical Association. I'm a medical student. And you just mentioned mandatory limits for prescribers of opioids. And I'm curious, is it advisable to create hard limits that prevent the clinician from exercising their medical judgment in some cases where a patient, let's say, may have long-standing legitimate opioid usage and actually might need a longer prescription?
Well, you've brought the crux of the argument right up front, because there are people who have chronic pain who absolutely need and rely on pain medicines to really to get them move around and for their quality of life. 28 states, I believe, have already passed this shortening of the amount of time that you can prescribe an opioid. Our state just did this. Some of them are 7 days, some people want to go to 3 days. But where I think, where the argument gets weak in terms of a set limit is when you have a child who, and all three of mine have had their wisdom teeth taken out, and they come home with a prescription for 50 pills. And we all know, even as your most dramatic child cannot draw out a wisdom tooth for 50 days. And so, you know, 48 hours might make a lot of sense, even if it does. I mean, you know, so I think we need to work with our physicians to make sure. But one of the weaknesses we found was there any education in medical school to really as to the negative effects, to the benefits, and to how to prescribe properly. And so we're tightening all that. A lot of our medical schools are on board with that, and I'm sure you'll find that too as you're in school. And thank you for being a doctor.
Good morning. My name is Robert Alvarez, and I'm with CADCA, Community Anti-Drug Coalitions of America.
Yeah.
You spoke a lot about a lot of the bipartisan efforts for treatment and rehabilitation. Can you speak a little bit more towards plans towards prevention? And
yes. Well, thank you for bringing that up too, because as I was thinking, what are the things that I didn't talk about that's been really critical in our state is the community drug-free communities programs. These are community from the ground up with their health officers, school officers, members of the community, public, you know, everybody kind of banding together along with high schools. And then the high school students will go in and try to peer-to-peer work on educating their, not only the ones that they're in their class with, but even the younger ones. These are critical. This is where we're going to solve it, is going to be from the ground up. And I'm going to use Jackson County, West Virginia as an example. Jackson County, that's the first time I was ever exposed to drug-free communities. And we got in a circle, and the reason they started is because they had 4 deaths in their high school. And the community just decided, we can't keep doing this. We've got to do something. We can't wait on government to solve this for us. And so those are critical. That is under the President's Office of Drug Control Policy. There's been some controversy. The President has, in his budget, wanted to move those out into different agencies. I personally wanted to remain in the White House to keep the focus, along with the high-intensity drug task forces that we see are helping our states quite a bit, in our state particularly. Yeah. Oh.
You mentioned about...
Hold on one second for the mic, and if you can identify yourself. And there's the mic. There's the mic.
Oh, sorry. My name is Anna Veria, Policy Director for the Department of Behavioral Health, DC. And my question is, you mentioned about the lack of providers in the area of mental health and substance use abuse. So what initiatives do you know that have been effective to incentivize providers to come along in this field?
Well, I think there's two things. I think we've looked at it from this aspect to help. I think one way to attract people into certain areas that they might be interested in is, number one, knowing they're going to have a job, and number two, some loan forgiveness as they've moved through their education. So we've looked at that in terms of attracting more mental health professionals. The other thing that has been looked at, and the VA is working on this in an experimental way, is telehealth. Mental health, telehealth, to try to spread your provider network further and broader than it can be if you're just in a concentrated area like you are here in Washington. But it is a big problem, and we know why it's a big problem. It's a tough job. It is a tough job, and you have to be able to have welcome success, but also failure is very difficult, because people in addiction, a lot of times, not one treatment, not two, but it has to be, and it doesn't just affect the person who's addicted, it's the entire family and the community around that person as well. But I will say this, Cabell County, which is Huntington, West Virginia, just now hired their own school psychologist just for this reason, and this person roves in and around all of the schools to work with students that are particularly impacted by this and identified as such.
Question. One more question.
Hi, Stacy Bridges with Veterans Vision. Two questions. First question is, what role do legislators play in the flood of opioids that are in your town? Williamson, West Virginia had 20 million opioids for a town of just 3,000 people. What role does campaign cash play in that, as far as allowing these pill mills to set up? And my second question is, what are you doing with cannabis? Because cannabis, even though the U.S. government has the patent on cannabis, it's known to help treat not only cancer, ADHD, autism, but it also helps people suffering from opioid addiction as well. What are you doing with cannabis as an alternative to these pills that are killing people and are addictive?
The first question, I would say that not only did Williamson have an influx, but a little town of Gilbert that had 390 people over a space of a year had millions of pills dispensed in a pharmacy. I'm like you. How did this happen? How could this have gone unnoticed? That's why I think CARA 2.0 and the original CARA about what we have better reporting and drug monitoring is going to help a lot. I think somebody was asleep at the switch here. I don't know where our Board of Pharmacy was in West Virginia overseeing where this is. Also, I'm on a bill with Senator Feinstein. I believe it's going to be, we're hoping to have it passed here shortly, which will help identify nefarious activity at certain pharmacies, and so that should help. But I will say this, there are a lot of lawsuits going on right now on this various thing in our brought by our cities, our counties, because in a lot of places, our municipalities and our local governments and our state governments are having to pay the after effects of this addiction, which is very expensive. The second question was cannabis. Our state just passed a medical marijuana law. I think a lot of states are doing that. They're now hung up on how to bank it. I think that's a big issue. I was chairman of financial institutions on the House side. We never quite got her. Colorado kept working on me, but we never quite got around to that. I'd like to see more research and development in this area so that we actually know the effects and know where it can be most beneficial. So I think the states are moving in this direction.
That is all the time we have. Please thank the Senator for joining us this morning. I'm going to hand it back to Diane.